Good morning. Welcome to the third webinar in the Runny Center's Back to School Blueprint series. Past webinars have focused on issues ranging from addressing trauma to building strong school communities to supporting students in accessing high-quality grade-level content. Today's webinar looks at effective strategies to support remote learning. Regardless of what reopening plan your community is pursuing, from remote learning to a hybrid or blended approach to in-person instruction, we believe that over the next hour, you'll encounter valuable strategies for supporting students' growth, development, well-being, and achievement. A quick word of introduction as we get started. My name is Chad D'Entremont. I'm the Executive Director of the Runny Center for Education Research and Policy. The Runny Center's mission is the Runny Center is an independent, nonpartisan research organization whose mission is to ensure that public education is well informed through deep knowledge and evidence of effective policymaking and practice. I am joined today by a number of prestigious panelists who will be introduced as they join the conversation. But as we like to joke, we wouldn't have invited them if they weren't eminently qualified, and we look forward to hearing to what they have to share. So let's get started. Today's discussion, following welcomes and introductions, will focus on the Runny Center's Back to School Blueprint. It will give you an overview of the content included in the Remote Learning Action Guide and a brief tour. We will then shift to speaker presentations and discussion. And following information shared by our guests, we will turn to an audience Q&A. The Back to School Blueprint series, of which the Supporting Remote Learning Action Guide is one of 7 action guides, is a series of research-based interactive online tools that are designed to help schools prepare to reopen. These guides aim to address the pressing issues facing our students right now while moving towards a more supportive, equitable, and high-performing system in general. As I mentioned, the Remote Learning Guide is one of 7 guides that can be found on the Runny Center's website, runnycenter.org. And they address a range of topics across students' social, emotional, and academic development, as well as school operations and approaches to teaching and learning. Our original intent in producing these guides was to help schools prepare for what we inevitably thought would be a return to normal. We now realize that this is not the case. And we envision these guides as living documents that aren't only designed to help you prepare for the now, but to provide support for the coming school year and the uncertainties and inevitable challenges that will result in a COVID era. We will continue to update them throughout the year, and we would encourage you all to continue to use them to think through what are the most effective strategies to support teaching and learning both remotely and in person. Now let's turn to the Remote Learning Guide. Our support for remote learning focuses on 3 core areas: relationships, instructional methods, and technology. We start with relationships because it is so critical to learning. If students aren't feeling safe, supported, able to navigate their daily lives or quiet anxieties and concerns they might feel, they can't learn. And we need to think critically about how to develop relationships in this new state of affairs in order to make sure that the things that schools do so well and naturally in in-person settings remain in remote learning environments. Strong connections between students and teachers, strong relationships among peers, and good communication between schools and families. Next, we focus on instructional methods because it's important to emphasize that even if the delivery of education may be shifting, we still want students to develop essential skills and competencies while accessing high-quality standards-based content. But in a new environment, how do we maximize the time between teachers and students while creating structured environments when students are learning independently so they're able to make progress on their own? And perhaps most importantly, when it comes to instruction, how do we see this as an opportunity? For years now, we've been talking about ways to make learning more personalized, more aligned with students' interests and passions, more adapted to the real world. And remote or distance learning provides an opportunity to do this provided that we can combine it with ensuring that students still master the essential skills and competencies that will help them grow into becoming successful adults. And finally, the remote learning guide focuses on technology. It's important to note that part of the emphasis on technology is making sure that schools, families, and students have access to the appropriate tools that they need to participate in remote learning. We all know that there is a digital divide, and inequities in access to technology have undermined the learning of students who have historically been most marginalized in our system. But I also want to emphasize that technology is more than just a tool. We now live in a world that is dependent on tech. To use the Rennie Center as an example, we are an organization focused on research, technical assistance, and communication. If a new employee showed up on the first day of work and we said to them, oh, sorry, we don't have any computers, we don't use them. Here's a piece of paper and a pen, they would be astounded by that approach to engaging the world at large. And it's important that we think about technology, we treat it the same way in schools. It can alter teacher and student relationships so they find new ways to communicate with each other. It can help students build essential 21st century skills, both technical skills such as coding and development of computer science skills, as well as other ways to communicate in a growing high-tech workforce. And finally, it can revolutionize learning itself by providing those more hands-on constructivist approaches that we've always wanted to emphasize for students. So in sum, the Support for Remote Learning Guide doesn't just talk about how to access technology, but thinks about how to use it as well. So let's look a little bit more deeply at the content in the guide. In the relationships section, you'll find guidance on how students and educators can build their relationships to focus on trust and consistency. One of the things we emphasize is the need for routine and structure to stay constant, even in a remote learning environment. One way to do that might be create community agreements between teachers and students. So there's a shared understanding of how they should engage with each other. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to drop our focus on students' social and emotional needs, even though we might not be connecting directly with them on as consistent a basis, certainly not connecting with them as often in person. There are strategies including the guide, such as relationship mapping, so schools and teachers can analyze the relationships they have with students and think about how to take action. We also focus on peer-to-peer relationships and see remote learning as an opportunity to encourage collaborative learning, to focus on relationship building activities, and leverage independent work time where students can work with one another outside the direct supervision of an instructor to build ways of working together collaboratively, cooperatively, to learn, to grow, and to achieve. And finally, we think it's important to focus on the school to family relationship and begin to strengthen something that some schools certainly do well, but other communities struggle with. And this is an opportunity to build strong communication between schools and families by doing outreach, by creating hubs for information and resources, and making sure that communication goes two ways. So schools aren't just informing families of what they're doing, but they're listening to them as well, and they're involving them in the remote learning process. As we shift to instructional methods matter, I want to point out that the Rennie Center has another online action guide called Accessing Grade Level Content. You'll find links to that in the Support for Remote Learning guide in the appropriate sections. And that guide gets heavily into how to make sure that students have access to standards-based content. Much of the focus on instructional methods matter in the remote learning guide is thinking about how to adapt the delivery of content and information that teachers may be providing to students for a remote environment. To think about how to promote interactivity. So it's not just a product of watching a video or listening to a presentation, but people are actively engaged through an online experience. This can allow instruction to become more creative and more relevant to students' daily lives. As I said a moment ago, we see this as a real opportunity to rethink approaches to learning so they better match the world that students, especially younger students, are now growing up in. We think it's important to differentiate instruction. One of the opportunities as well that comes through a remote learning experience is there's so many ways to deliver content. And by actually using multiple methods, students who learn in different ways may be better served by the instruction that's provided. And as we do this over time, we can begin to personalize approaches so each student finds a way in a remote learning environment that works for them. And finally, we focus on technology. We help readers of the Action Guide think through how to assess and understand IT infrastructure and needs, how to connect families with low-cost devices and internet service, and how to identify community hotspots and/or deploy mobile hotspot programs. For those who are facing a digital divide, it's often hard to come up with solutions. What do we do if we can't directly show up at a house and hand over a device that someone can use? Well, there are options out there. And the guide includes strategies that communities and schools may use to bridge the gap that may exist in technology within a school or between families and schools so everyone can access learning. We also think it's important to provide ongoing access to tech support via help desks, virtual tech cafes, video tutorials, and other examples. And to get creative in doing this, one example worth noting is in Burlington High School, where the the tech support help desk is staffed by students who often have more knowledge and experience working with technology than the adults, and they can provide direct support to those who reach out to the school for help in accessing learning content. So if that's the content within the guide, I want to take a brief moment just to give you a quick tour. I'm not going to go in depth because my hope is that people on this webinar will access the guide themselves and do their own learning. But I do want to share what is in the guide, and so you can see how it goes beyond the slides I've presented. If the slides communicate to you all what is in the Action Guide, in actually engaging with the Action Guide itself, I hope you'll understand that it's very much about how to do this. Once you've made a commitment to building a relationship, thinking through the delivery of instruction or bringing new technological solutions, how would you do this? And that's where the guide is here to help. All the Rennie Center's guides begin with a title page that provides an outline of what the focus of the guide is on, followed by a table of contents. You can also find the table of contents simply by clicking the Begin button. It will appear on the left side. The Remote Learning Action Guide is slightly different than other guides in that it focuses on very much what is a shifting environment and set of decisions being made by education leaders in response to COVID-19. So the beginning of the guide attempts to provide context around what's happening and some basic information that we think everyone should know. Looking at responses to remote learning during COVID-19 and what we should know and understand about remote learning, including how students are responding to the current moment based on responses to surveys. In this one visual, you'll see how students have reported that 64% report distractions at home in virtual or remote learning environments. 50% feel depressed, stressed, and anxious. 30% report that they do not have an adult who can help them with their schoolwork. Along with feedback from students, there is also feedback from educators as well as from families about how they are experiencing the remote learning environment. Well, if we're going to share you what people are thinking, we also want to share with you solutions. And so as you proceed through the Action Guide, you'll find sections on previous guidance that's already been given on remote learning, including the research base on what works and what might not, and a best practices overview. But ultimately, you'll find the meat of the guide in two sections: best practices in relationships matter, instructional methods, and technology, and then how to get ready, preparing educators for remote learning, families for remote learning, and students for remote learning. Each guide ends with action steps that individuals can take. So here you'll see a list of action steps that a school leader could take, as well as action steps to do later that require more planning, and finally, action steps for educators. There is also a going deeper section for with more resources and an acknowledgement section. I'm going to take a very quick look at one thing to hopefully give people a sense of what is in the Action Guide, and then trust that people will find it and navigate it on their own. So if I go to the Relationships Matter section, you'll recall one of the things I mentioned as possible for a strategy to build relationships is something known as relationship mapping. Well, if you go into the relationship matters section, you'll find a section on relationship mapping and how to do it in a virtual classroom. From there, you'll find links to Making Caring Common, an organization that specializes in this approach, and a website with videos, tools, and other resources that can be used for how to do it. And then a series of instructions that take you through the process so you could lead it yourself, from how to do virtual mapping, to having a reflective meeting among staff, to thinking about action planning and what was shared, to making sure you do follow-up and analyzing the data that was collected. And one more time, the action guide is filled with these types of resources that can be used in order to make sure you go from the what do we need to do to develop a successful remote learning environment to how do we do it. In closing, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways that we have found to be most important when thinking about how to pursue a remote learning environment. One, prioritize a model of self-care. Make sure that families and students are well supported, are able to engage, and feel like they are being holistically advantaged socially, emotionally, and academically from the learning experience. But self-care also relates to school staff themselves, and check in with leaders and educators to make sure that they are feeling comfortable in a remote learning environment that may be new to them. Doing this means including educator, student, and family voices in your processes. Make sure that you're soliciting, processing, and applying feedback, and that this is a community-wide effort, since so much of the learning will take place outside of school. Attempt to engage in continuous learning. This is a positive way of saying, we're not gonna all get it right out of the gate. This is a new experience for almost all of us, and we'll make mistakes. And strategies that are used to deliver instruction or to assess learning may not take the first time, or may not be the best approach. And be prepared to adjust based on the feedback you're receiving. Be mindful of adapting approaches to support diverse learners, including special education students and English language learners. And as you begin to develop your remote learning approach, think bigger. Think about how it's an opportunity to personalize the work that you're doing. With that, it's a brief overview of the action guide to support remote learning. I hope you all will take time to dig in more fully to the resource, and I'm delighted to shift now to our panelists to share their own thoughts and opinions on remote learning. With that, it's my privilege to introduce Christina Stanojevic, Boston Public Schools and Teach Plus Massachusetts Policy Fellow, to share some information or on-the-ground perspectives from teachers. Christina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So I'll start by talking briefly about the survey that Teach Plus recently put out. If you could just go to the next slide for me. So we put out a survey on teacher engagement and compiled a report called Lessons from the Remote Classroom. This report basically compiled the reflections on remote learning from spring 2020 and put together teacher recommendations for the upcoming school year. We surveyed 1,398 teachers and school members and looked at we had teachers or responses from 167 school districts and charters across Massachusetts. So based on their experiences in the spring with remote learning, teachers gave us basically 5 categories of recommendations. The first, which I'm not going to spend too much time on, was basically safety protocols, right? Teachers want to make sure that before any in-person learning happens, we have thorough safety protocols to make sure that students and teachers and everyone in a school building can be safe. But for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the other 4 categories that teachers were really talking about in their recommendations. That's expectations from the school, state, and district levels, social emotional learning, technology, and high quality instruction. So around expectations, teachers are looking for clarity and consistency in the expectations delivered by their schools, districts, and states, especially around instructional strategies, grading, attendance, schedules, parent expectations, and assessment. This time period has really showed us that it is far too common that policymakers make decisions about what is happening in the classroom without bringing teachers, students, and other school community stakeholders to the table. So teachers right now are really emphasizing that it's important that we are a part of that conversation and that these decisions are made with enough time for us to plan and prepare. We can do a lot of amazing things if we are given the time to do so. The other focus was on social emotional learning. Teachers across the board agree that there needs to be social emotional learning and a focus on social emotional well-being of both teachers and students. And that SEL, or social emotional learning, and relationship building needs to be integrated into both our curriculum, our day-to-day lessons, and our overall school culture. What was interesting about the transition to virtual learning was that teachers found that they had a whole new tool set for engaging and building those relationships, from texting with students, talking on GChat, emailing, using FaceTime, using apps like Remind, or talking through other ed tech apps like Khan Academy or Google Classroom. They were able to really expand those relationships. But it also emphasized that the barriers that existed before COVID are making it even more difficult to get in touch with specific students. Things like phone numbers that don't actually work, email addresses that are missing for parents and families. Some families don't have access to good internet still, despite the efforts that have been made. And some families are in transitional housing. So those issues need to be dealt with so that teachers really can reach all of their students. There was also a focus on the need for technology support. So teachers, students, and families alike need access to high quality technology. That may just be, we need laptops that actually can run the software you're asking us to run, or touch screens so that we can actually write on slides as we talk to students and give feedback, or even document cameras, things like this that we can really bring that learning into the online environment. But it's also about support and resources for students and families as well. So a lot of teachers, in fact, almost 50% of our respondents said that they didn't feel they had the necessary tools and resources for remote learning. And one of the things that they're really looking for is a sort of playbook of ed tech apps, right? So a kind of comprehensive list of here are the things that are available to you, and here's how you could adapt them to this grade level and this content. But more than that, and this is really coming from students and families as well, is the need for consistency across platforms and apps that are being used. When you've got a family with 3 kids, all in BPS, maybe at different schools with different teachers, all using different apps and platforms to communicate with their teachers, it can get really burdensome for the families. So there's definitely a push for creating that consistency there. Then we also have the instructional, high quality instruction as a major focus for what teachers are looking to both share about and learn more about. So in our survey, we found that only about 50% of respondents felt that they were able to really foster meaningful engagement in their virtual classrooms. And those who felt successful with it shared a lot of those strategies, talking about things like using innovative instructional strategies like project-based learning, making it real world and relevant, connected to what's happening around us, integrating the concept of an open-walled classroom, virtual field trips, things like that. But we also had teachers pushing for more support in those areas. First, they're looking for online curriculum, right? Teachers are used to reinventing the wheel and building all of their curriculum materials themselves. But right now, we're really looking for curriculum that we can draw from, things that have been created that we can expand on, so that we can spend our time focusing on how to take those things and make them more innovative, because this is an opportunity to really reinvent school, which is something that we've been pushing for, but now we sort of have to do. And so one of the things that we're looking for is more opportunities for project-based learning, experimenting with competency-based grading, even reinventing the roles of support staff in schools to really help teachers meet the needs of their students. And finally, as schools and districts start to engage in this professional development around these things, teachers are looking for choice in their PD, so that they can fill the gaps that they have and also leverage the expertise that they have in these different areas. I'll just tie it out with a quick little anecdote about my own personal experience. When we moved last spring from our sort of crisis response learning in March to a structured schedule where our principal brought teachers to the table, asked students and parents their opinions, and we put together a schedule, we communicated it out to all of our families, we gave every student their own personal schedule with Zoom links embedded, and we made sure to include times for student get-togethers, social hours, things like that. The day we implemented that, student engagement in virtual learning increased about 50% at our school. So really honing in on that consistency, that clarity, that structure, and allowing students to feel like they can expand within that.
Great, thank you, Christina. We really appreciate you sharing that perspective and bringing the rich background of work that you've done to understand how teachers are engaging in a remote learning environment to the audience today. In the hope that we'll continue bringing to the fore such valuable insights, I'd like to shift to our panelists. It's my privilege to introduce, in order across the slide, Mark Racine, Chief Information Officer for Boston Public Schools, Monica Quinchillo, Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at America's Promise, and Jal Mehta, Professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. To the three of you, thank you for being with us today. We can't wait to hear your insights and share in your expertise. And with that, Mark, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and the floor will be yours.
Thank you, Chad, and thank you, Christina, for that wonderful introduction. There's a lot of things that really resonated with me, both of us being in Boston Public Schools, but also, when I look at the Rennie Center's playbook, there's a lot of things that we learned a lot through closure, and I use closure in air quotes because it doesn't feel like we ever closed. We just went home, and then now thinking about reopening. So in my role in the Boston Public Schools, we were pretty busy this spring setting the technology infrastructure in place. And for that, a lot of folks think about technology infrastructure for remote learning as the devices and the hotspots. But it has a much more broad definition. The Boston Public Schools has a stronger infrastructure than most school districts, and we've been putting in place a lot of technology over the last few years that allowed us to pivot very, very quickly to remote learning from one day to the next. In fact, we closed on a Monday. Teachers were teaching the very next day. There were other districts that I've spoken to that it took them a couple of weeks to get things in place, whereas for us, the vast majority of our operations and instructional tools are cloud-based. So we had that flexibility. I think that was really the highlight of our closure was we had to embrace flexibility. Not just with the infrastructure and the tools that you're using, but also the policies and practices and operations that you're putting in place. When we think about technology support prior to COVID, you always think about a one-to-one rollout and how are you going to roll out devices, and it's always a multi-year process or planning process. We announced closure on a Friday night, and on Saturday we said to all principals, send all of your devices home on Monday. Just send them home. And that's a very frightening thing to think about in hindsight, but we had to have that flexibility to pivot and rethink how we do a lot of different things. And so our infrastructure had to be very flexible and mobile to go from in-person to online the very next day. Our policies and practices for how we track devices, how we assign devices to students had to suddenly shift. But most of all, the mindset of all of us, both from those of us in the classroom to those of us in the central office and technology support roles, had to just really embrace flexibility and understand that we're in a very different world, a very different mindset. It's not about teaching in the classroom with incorporating some cloud-based tools or incorporating technology. It's now everything is now remote, and so how do you make sure that your infrastructure, your policies, and your practices are flexible? One of the things that we purposely did prior to announcing closure was, when it became obvious that we're going to be closing schools in the very near future, we got together and said, all right, we're going to need to add a few things. We're going to need to add a few platforms. We're going to need to move a few of our paper-based texts to online. But we made the very conscious decision to minimize the amount of change. And that's because we knew that teachers were going to be changing everything about their classroom overnight. And we needed to make sure that we didn't inundate them with new platforms and new technologies to add to the process. So we chose not to add a new learning management system. We chose to embrace Google Classroom. And some may say that it's not really designed for remote learning, but it was what teachers were used to. And so that's what we really pushed and really emphasized to say, let's try to stick as much as you can, stick with what you're used to. And as you start to go into areas that you're not comfortable with, you'll at least have something familiar. And that's really what allowed our teachers to pivot, because we didn't try to inundate them with too many new things. Now, what really resonated a lot with me when Christine was talking about teachers wanting more technology resources, and as we are planning our reopening, that same lesson really has to be at the forefront around what are the new tools, new resources, new technologies that you provide to teachers to go farther than we did in the spring. But I think she really balanced that challenge that families had of having too many apps and too many logins and too many different passwords. And so it's something where this summer, as we're planning for reopening, we are adding new technologies, we are adding new platforms, but we really emphasize integration and making sure that the new platforms that we do use are have basic things like single sign-on and rostering in place, and it's a one-click entry point. And we are not going to add too many new technologies that will take away from the focal point of the classroom, which we fully believe is the classroom teacher. So in closing, as we prepare for reopening, my hope is that our students and families think about reopening and coming back to school. They think of their teacher's face and not their laptop. But we know that as we go into reopening, you'll have a little bit of technology, regardless of whether it's hybrid or remote. So with that, I will turn it over to Monica.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And good morning to everyone. I want to say thanks to the Rennie Center for inviting me here. And it's been really wonderful to hear a little bit more about what's happening in Boston from Christina and Mark. So I am joining from a national organization called America's Promise Alliance. And we are a national nonprofit that works externally with a mix of community-based and national youth supporting organizations across the country. And internally, our team competencies are really in youth engagement, research, communications, and collective leadership within our alliance. So given the COVID pandemic and the broad impact on young people's housing, health, family income, and their educations, our work has really shifted in the last few months to focus on how each of our campaigns and initiatives can do a few things. First, elevate the voices of young people, highlight what is working well in the field across the learning environments that young people are in, and support the field in a time when equity, we believe, must be at the center. Our approach at America's Promise is anchored in the principles of what young people need to thrive, rather than a specific model or program. And really, remote learning in a pandemic requires a return to foundational principles of human development, because we don't have our usual access to human capital, relationships, facilities, structures, and materials. And so I think when you hear the word innovation and creativity, it's really kind of pulling on that notion that we need to kind of go back to some basics. We know more now than we ever have about how a young person's brain develops and how its social, emotional, and cognitive parts work together to interpret and interact with its environment. And so a return to fundamentals really means the focus first has to be on the young person himself and the relationships that help to activate the social and emotional connections that are required for learning. And really at its heart, this requires us to know what our young people are experiencing and what they need to feel connected to the adults and peers in school in a remote setting. So I know we'll talk much more in the discussion coming up here, but I wanted to share a few insights that we've gathered as part of our How Learning Happens research series. And we've learned the perspectives and are sharing the experience of thousands of young people through our quantitative and qualitative studies And I know survey data has already been shared here, and definitely appreciate that. So just want to put the caveat that this was national data and not just Massachusetts specific. So Ellie, if we could just share that first slide, that would be great. So we surveyed a nationally sorry, I'm not seeing a slide. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So we surveyed over 3,000 high school aged young people across the country to better understand their social and emotional well-being during the initial school closures back in the spring. And so this feels a little bit old, but really does highlight how young people were feeling at a time that was really crisis education mode. And I'm sharing this because I think it's important to really signal a need to prioritize those social and emotional aspects of the learning experience. And that is really the foundation from which we think an effective school year can begin. So we learned that about a quarter of young people are feeling disconnected entirely from their school communities, school adults, and classmates. And overall, just about a third are feeling mostly or extremely connected. If we could go to the next slide, young people reported poorer emotional and cognitive health, and this was really linked to their home lives. So just this notion that people around them are sick, people around them are getting laid off, there's a lot of family income stress, and often, you know, family duties like taking care of siblings or being challenged by not enough devices in the home for a variety of reasons. I think the good news, though, if we go to the next slide, is that young people who did receive some type of social or emotional support during that initial school closure or school shift reported that the social and emotional support that was offered was helpful. So I think this is really empowering and should signal the prioritization really of those social and emotional supports to create that connection, create that bond to what is now no longer a physical building or space in which young people can interact with young people and adults, but is through some other method, but is human-based. So before I kind of get to closing here on the intro, I want to share a few findings from a qualitative study we did. So if we go to the next slide, this qualitative study was done pre-COVID, so it was rooted in-person interviews with young people who are in school and out of school time programming that is ultimately youth-centered and in an intentional way. And our goal was really to study what is happening in these learning environments that really fosters the social, emotional, and cognitive development of young people. And we learned pretty clearly that learning environments in which young people are known and are centered reflect reflect these characteristics: intentionality, a focus on relationships, and opportunities to develop identity, agency, and belonging, and then opportunities to engage in meaningful learning. And I'm sure we'll talk about all of these things a little bit throughout the rest of this discussion. But these are really the foundational principles. And I know there's a lot of discussion about logistics and PPE in the event that there is in-person learning. But when it comes to that interaction between young people and adults in this new world, the bedrock maybe doesn't need to be what it usually is, which is like assess the kids, understand where you have to go, and then align instruction. The bedrock may actually need to be relationship building time and intentional structures in the school day to make that happen. So I'm gonna look ahead to the discussion to tease out exactly what it might look like to adapt what we know are the characteristics of a youth-centered learning environment into these remote learning times. But I want to close with one thought, which is, you know, just like for many of us as adults, there's no line now between work and home. That's true for young people too. There's no line between their school life, their home life, and what for, I often am thinking about the adolescents is their social life, though true for younger kids as well. And so I think that really has to challenge all of us to have a lot of empathy and grace among each other as adults and for the young people for whom we're working. And I think we have to do two things to prioritize that. And one is to understand our young people I share these data because I think you have to know where young people are coming from to be able to have an effective implementation of any kind. And I think the other thing that this pandemic is forcing all of us to do in the system is to work much more collaboratively with parents and families, which we may not have historically done well, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't start now. So I'll close with that and pass the mic to Jal for his introduction. Jal, I think you're muted.
Great. Thanks so much, Monica. Could you put that last slide back up? That would be great. Because the characteristics that Monica and her team identified in her research are spot on with the characteristics that Sarah Fine and I identified in our research on deeper learning in schools and out of school spaces. So if you took that list as a kind of a starting point, I think my big observation about COVID was that the circumstances really changed significantly, but the sort of our mindsets and how we think about what school could look like in this environment did not change much. And in the spring, you know, it was sort of like change on a dime. Teachers are, you know, often caretakers of their own kids. It's just sort of an impossible situation for everyone. But with a little more time to plan over the summer, it seems like there might be opportunities to introduce some of those elements into schooling this year. So over the summer, we ran some design charrettes with students, teachers, parents, and administrators, just sort of thinking about what had worked and not worked in the fall and what would work in the spring. And Elle has posted the links to those in the chat. Thank you for that. And so a lot of the elements that students and teachers named were quite similar to the ones in the Rennie Center report. So I just want to pull out kind of a few ideas from that report. One was to Marie Kondo, the curriculum. Someone just said this in the middle of one of our sessions, and like everybody just kind of stopped and looked at her and was like, yes, that is a good idea. So Marie Kondo, the Japanese cleaning expert, says that you should clear out your house of all but the items that give you joy. And that might be a good way to think about the curriculum for this upcoming year, that if kids are continuing to work remotely in your setting, the goal of trying to teach them every last thing that you would have taught them is really not realistic. And so what you want to do is prioritize, keep the essential things, but create enough space to go deep around the things that catch the students' interests and are connected to the major concepts and skills that you think are important for students to learn in a given year. So I feel like one of the things about the thinking for this year is there are sort of so many suggestions, and from the point of view of teachers, there's really only so much time. And so the question is like, can we take some things off the table as well as kind of putting things on the table? Will that give us an opportunity to go deeper on the things that are meaningful? So that's one. The second one is that building time is gold. So if you get any time in person, you know, kids are starved for human contact. They haven't seen their friends, they haven't seen their teachers. And so using that time to build the kind of relationships and classroom culture is really critical for sustaining it if and when things move back to remote learning. In a sense, it was easier last year because teachers already had those relationships with students, and it'll be more challenging this year because for teachers who are starting new online, they won't have that. So if there is any time in person, using that to sort of build community seems really critical. With respect to equity, I think we should think kind of more broadly than we usually do. We kind of have in this country been thinking a lot about equity in terms of test score gaps, and only in the last maybe 5 to 7 years has there been sort of a mainstream recognition that building on students' assets and thinking about students, and particularly students of color, as sort of whole people is critical for moving forward. So, you know, there are fantastic opportunities to learn about race, protests, pandemic, disproportionate impacts of COVID, Black Lives Matter, the election. There is sort of so much rich text that is so vivid in students' lives. And the more we can connect to that, the more engaged they're likely to be. The literature on virtual learning is not that positive, but the literature on kind of interest-based online learning is pretty positive. So in other words, if you build a community of students who are interested in doing or producing something, then like online is just sort of a modality. Whereas if you are sort of like trying to get kids to like do the same sort of things that they didn't really want to do when they were in class, it's going to be a lot harder when you're not standing over them. So shifting the assignments in ways that create more student agency and opportunities for them to produce. They can use Zoom basically the way that we use Zoom as working adults. Like it would be nice occasionally to have a meeting with someone in person, but we can work this way. And so can especially middle and high school students. My 4th grade student is writing a book with some of his friends, and they meet weekly on Zoom calls. We went to the pond and my son told me he needed to leave the pond because he needed to complete a Zoom call. So if you give students agency and opportunity to control their work, they really can move forward. And then the point that Chad made at the beginning about organizational learning is really, really critical for this year. There's a thing called shadow a student, where you sort of follow a student through their day. I think like 3 weeks into the year would be a really good time for some adults to essentially like live a virtual day with students and just sort of like see what it's like to be on Zoom all day, and then think about doing some troubleshooting based on what they learn. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, thank you to all 3 of you, and of course, Christina as well. We really appreciate the insights you've shared and how you've pushed our thinking forward on ways to create supportive remote learning environments. With an eye on time, I want to shift now to the Q&A from the audience. I'll forego the questions I was going to ask. To be frank, I think you answered all of them with your thorough responses, and use this as a moment to encourage anyone who is on the webinar in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to bring new questions to the fore. We're happy to address those as well. Some of them are a bit specific, so I'll be upfront with everyone and say I might broaden them a little bit in the interest of discussion, but hopefully they will capture the spirit of what is being asked. One other comment before shifting to Q&A, a number of the questions ask about what we know on various topics, what we know about how resources are being used, what we know about the burden that's been placed on educators currently to adapt their learning environments. And to be frank, we don't know a lot. Things are moving so fast, it's been hard to do research and evaluation. And to be frank, things are also quite uncertain. So it's hard to do an evaluation that's actually focused on understanding specific, clear phenomena. It's work that absolutely needs to be done. We'll be honest on this call right here about what we know. But one thing that I could use this platform for is say, like, we really actually do need to catch our breath, take time and figure out what happened with all of this so we can be well informed moving forward. All right, so let me, I'm gonna move around a little bit. I wanna start with the teacher one first. And Christina, to give you a little bit of a heads up, I'll come to you. I'll tweak this a little bit to say, like, we have introduced a lot of ideas over the past 50 minutes. Change the learning environment, think about delivering instruction differently, make sure when you do that, you're actually using new technological tools. Can you reflect a little bit, if you have any hard numbers, that would be great, but if not, I think just your reflections are fine on what this means for teachers. Or do they find themselves working more? Do they find themselves working less because they're not in school all day? Is it about the same? How would you answer that question? And then we'll open up to the other panelists.
Yeah, so for the most part, teachers have reported working more, especially in those first weeks after we closed down. Now, of course, we have different familiarities with the platforms being used, but between learning how to use new tech, just learning how to record videos of yourself and then post them online for students, between that and developing new content. And then also, and I think the question asked specifically about this, contact with students is constant. And Monica mentioned that, you know, the border between the school day and your personal life is gone, right? And I literally have students texting me at 2 a.m. because that's when they do their homework. And so one of the things we've talked about, at least at my school, we've put together task forces, academic, operations, social emotional learning, and we're talking about how to reestablish those boundaries for ourselves and for our own social and emotional well-being, but also how to clearly communicate that to our students, right? So like when I have a kid calling me at 8 p.m. on a Friday, like, this is an emergency, and I pick up the phone because I'm so scared for them, and then it turns out they're just like, I don't know how to access that document. You know, those are the kinds of things that we have to establish early on with one-on-one conversations, with setting those community norms together. So in our social emotional learning task force at my school, one of the things we're doing is getting perspective from students, so reaching out to our students, asking how, what they needed and how it went for them and how we can adapt for them. And then also looking at ways that we can set the groundwork by having those one-on-one meetings, by having social time for students, by having advisories, by doing assemblies and talent shows, as well as integrating, you know, breakout rooms and one-on-one time and emotional check-ins during class, so that we can really create those norms together and have a consistent way to build those relationships with students without having to completely erase our personal lives. But I think a lot of the things we've talked about in terms of what teachers are asking for with like ed tech playbooks and time to plan, if we are given those things, we will be better able to balance our work and our personal lives.
Can I open up to the rest of the panel and perhaps reflections on what teachers may be experiencing now, but also just ideas about how we can create that time and space for school leaders and educators so they feel like they can get through the day?
I'm happy to jump in a little bit on this. I think this is one of those things that a lot of schools have actually figured out in pre-COVID times. And for them, it's been relatively seamless to transition into this remote environment. So I think the challenge perhaps is actually around mindsets initially for any school team that maybe hadn't previously carved out time, like a specific 45 minutes that is all about a teacher being with the same group of just 20 young people to foster that level of relationship. And then correspondingly, you need to really establish that same period of time for adults to interact and really have that learning community environment. You know, Chad, I think in your presentation, you mentioned the need to iterate and reflect and adapt because none of us have done this before. And so I think intentionally carving out that time and making it sacred because it's so important to have those relationships and the emotional connections, especially when you don't have physical proximity. You have to prioritize it. And so I think it's about creating a schedule that maybe looks different, frankly, than previous school years, and just, you know, being okay with that, but making sure that your adults and young people are kind of normed on how that time is to be used. You know, it probably needs some facilitation guidance behind it as well. But some of this is change management on multiple levels, right? If you're not a school that had something like what some schools call crew or advisory, introducing crew and advisory for the first time in the 2021 school year might feel a little challenging because not only are you introducing it for the first time, but you're doing it remotely. And so I think that's where, you know, grace and reflection have to come in, but it's doable. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that everyone will benefit.
One other quick point.
Please, Joe, go ahead.
On that is it's also if you're a district and you have a number of like relatively small schools within your district, the thing that virtual creates is opportunities for learning across schools. So that's something that like in theory has always sounded good, but in practice, people always talk to the person next door. But if if you're a high school science teacher or middle school math teacher, like you might be the only person in your school who's teaching your content at your level. And so there really are, if everybody's home anyway, and you're going to go to a meeting where you're going to think about like how to make your content more engaging, maybe you want to have that meeting with the 4 other, middle school math teachers in the district, because those are the folks who are really doing the same thing that you're doing. So one district we've been working with, Jefferson County, Colorado, in the spring, they just declared that Monday was Teacher Learning Day. And so there was no school on Monday. Monday was the day where like kids caught up on all the stuff that they hadn't done during the rest of the week. And kids, it turned out they got some pushback like initially, but over time, people actually appreciated it because like no one wanted to be on Zoom all day. And so there was sort of like one day, and they used that day for teachers to basically have meetings with each other about what was working and what wasn't across the district. And then they were guided a little bit by the international research, which shows that in other countries, teachers spend less contact time with students and more time with each other planning. And so they were sort of trying to use COVID to implement that idea.
I was going to thank you for that and mention 2 things. One is, and what I heard Monica saying is, some of the answers are good practice that we probably should have implemented long ago, but it's forcing us to do now. Teaming design among faculty, data review of students to be proactive and not waiting for a crisis, co-planning to shoulder the burden of lesson planning across multiple groups. And then, Jal, as you mentioned, in cases where you might not have a peer to collaboratively plan with. There are resources out there you mentioned. I'm sure Maria Fenwick will appreciate the shout out. I was talking to her yesterday. She's with the Teachers Collaborative. There's other organizations out there as well, but they try to create online spaces for teachers to do that exact type of sharing as well in case there's not a school next door where they can connect with a peer. Let me, Mark, come to you. There's a couple questions about technology, and so I'm going to combine them. One is that, are there challenges that you anticipate for tech that you, as the year gets started? And then the state has been putting out resources around tech, linking folks to the Commonwealth Virtual School, creating other ways to access LMS or learning management systems. I guess what I'm asking you is, are there resources that you might recommend to folks, and are there challenges that you feel like you're directly trying to address?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I have to start by saying that we couldn't have done even half of what we did if it weren't for the resources that were provided by both the private and public sector at no cost to the districts. Many vendors made their platforms free for COVID. And I think that's something that I have to acknowledge, is that there were an enormous amount of resources that were just provided to us at low or no cost. In terms of what do I anticipate the challenges being for reopening, or even just coming back to school, I do, my biggest concern is that tech will be looked at as the only avenue for learning in a remote setting. And I think that's something that I'm very worried about, is that folks will think that we have to go back to normal structures and systems of students sitting in front of a teacher for 6.5 hours, which in a remote setting means sitting in front of a computer for 6.5 hours. And I really worry that we are going to interpret the new school year to more and more screen time. And Jal, when you mentioned, we were at the pond, and then your son says he's got to go back to a Zoom lesson. There's amazing positivity in the self-awareness and the advocacy on your son's part, but then this concern of like, you're missing out on this beautiful park to go back and stare at a screen. And so, I think we have to acknowledge that staring at a computer screen is exhausting, but also staring at a teacher sitting in a chair for 6.5 hours straight and staring at a teacher is exhausting. So I do think that, my concern is that technology will be the solution for a lot of life's problems moving forward, and we'll miss out on the beauty of relationships and solid classroom instruction because we will think that technology is the only way of doing this. So I do think the biggest technology problem we have is going to be teachers having to be creative about not using technology. And how do I do gym class without staring at a computer screen? How do I explore nature in another way other than staring at a Zoom or a YouTube video? So I do think that our biggest technology problems are going to be finding non-technology ways to solve a lot of our problems moving forward. And that is, and I think we've touched on a lot of this today, is this balance between restoring or going back to normal versus this push of like, let's not go back to systems and structures that didn't work for our students and for our teachers. So I think just keeping the balance and keeping the student social emotional learning needs in the front of our playbook, and being very thoughtful and careful about where we use new technology and where we use technology to solve a problem.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Well, unfortunately, we are at time. I do appreciate there are a whole host of questions in the Q&A box. And one of the things that I believe Rennie can do, and we'll work with our panelists for questions that are directed at them, is to perhaps put together what I call an FAQ. And when we release the recording for the webinar, perhaps we can also follow up and answer some of the questions that we didn't get to. I appreciate how much people are invested in this topic and have questions they're hoping to see answers to. I will note that a number of the questions we didn't get to, there are resources in the action guides. The support for remote learning guide itself that we're talking about includes a section with do's and don'ts for working with English language learners as well as special education students, and that addresses to some extent questions that were asked about those student populations. The trauma sensitive practice guide includes information on adult learning and supports, and starting with the self, and I would point people to that. And the Building Strong Communities Guide, although it doesn't specifically address paraprofessionals and teacher aides, which was in the question that was asked, does include a lot of information about outreach to families and communities and building strong relationships there. So hopefully you'll look into those action guides. Again, they're available at renniecenter.org. We'll do our best to follow up with questions that we didn't get to on this webinar when we do follow up related to sharing out other information. And before I sign off, the biggest thing I want to do is one more time thank all of our speakers. We're delighted to have their expertise and involvement today, and hopefully they were sharing information that those on this webinar will find beneficial as they go through the process of reopening schools and supporting learning in remote environments. Thank you to everybody. Take care. Have a great day.